The voice that crackled through the radio speakers aboard the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was a ghost on the radio waves. It was faint, laced with static, but it was unmistakably her, Amelia Earhart. For hours, her voice had been a tantalizing, frustrating presence, appearing and disappearing as she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, searched the vast, empty canvas of the Pacific for a tiny sliver of land called Howland Island. Now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky on the morning of July 2, 1937, her words carried a new, desperate urgency. "We must be on you, but cannot see you," she broadcast, her voice strained. "Gas is running low. Have been unable to reach you by radio." Aboard the Itasca, Chief Radioman Leo Bellarts frantically tried to reply, begging her to hold down her transmission key so they could get a radio direction finding, RDF, fix on her position. But her messages were too short. A few minutes later, another fragment of a sentence pierced the static. "We are circling, but cannot see you." Then, at 8:43 a.m., came the final, haunting transmission ever verified to be from Amelia Earhart. Her voice was clear, almost unnervingly calm, delivering a line of navigational data that would become the most scrutinized phrase in aviation history. "We are on the line 157337. We are running on north and south." And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that stretched from minutes into hours, from hours into days, and from days into an unending mystery that has captivated the world for nearly a century. The silence was the sound of the world's most famous aviator vanishing from the face of the earth. She had flown off the map and into legend, leaving behind only a final, cryptic message and a question that still haunts us. What happened after that last broadcast? Part 1. The Making of an American Icon. To understand the disappearance, one must first understand the woman. Amelia Earhart was more than just a pilot. She was a phenomenon. In an era when women were expected to confine their ambitions to the home, Earhart soared above them, both literally and figuratively. Born in Kansas in 1907, she was a gangly, boyish, and fiercely independent spirit who defied convention from a young age. She kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about successful women in male-dominated fields, from engineering to law. She was searching for a calling. She found it in 1920 on an airfield in Long Beach, California. For $10, she took a 10-minute joyride in a biplane. As the plane lifted off the ground, something inside her clicked into place. "As soon as we left the ground," she later wrote, "I knew I myself had to fly." Flying in the 1920s was a dangerous, exhilarating, and almost exclusively male pursuit. But Earhart was determined. She worked odd jobs as a truck driver, a photographer, a stenographer, to save the $1,000 needed for flying lessons. She cropped her hair short, bought a leather jacket, and affected an air of quiet, confident competence. She wasn't just learning to fly, she was crafting an image. Her big break came in 1928, seemingly out of nowhere. The public was still captivated by Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight the year before. A wealthy socialite named Amy Phipps Guest wanted to sponsor the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. The chosen pilot was Amelia Earhart, largely because her lanky build and striking resemblance to Lindbergh made her a publicist's dream. The press had already dubbed her Lady Lindy. In truth, her role on that flight was minimal. She was a passenger, or, as she wryly described it, a sack of potatoes. The plane was flown by 2 male pilots. But it didn't matter. When the Fokker Trimotor Friendship landed in Wales, Amelia Earhart became a global celebrity overnight. She was promoted and packaged by her brilliant publicist and future husband, George Palmer Putnam. Putnam saw in Earhart not just a pilot, but a brand. She was the face of modern American womanhood, courageous, independent, yet graceful and articulate. She endorsed everything from Lucky Strike cigarettes to her own line of luggage. She gave lectures, wrote books, and became a powerful advocate for women's rights and commercial aviation. But the sack of potatoes label stung her pride. She knew that to cement her legacy, she had to prove she was more than just a famous face. She had to match Lindbergh's feat, and she had to do it alone. On May 20th, 1932, 5 years to the day after Lindbergh's flight, she took off from Harbor House, Newfoundland, in a single-engine Lockheed Vega. Her destination was Paris. The flight was a harrowing ordeal. A cracked exhaust manifold threatened to fill the cockpit with deadly fumes. Her altimeter failed, forcing her to fly blind through treacherous weather. At one point, ice formed on her wings, sending the Vega into a terrifying spin toward the dark, churning waves of the Atlantic. She wrestled the plane back under control just feet from the water. After nearly 15 hours of battling mechanical failures and exhaustion, she knew she wouldn't make it to Paris. She spotted land, the coast of Ireland, and brought her plane down in a farmer's pasture in County Londonderry. When a farmhand rushed to the plane and asked, "Have you flown far?" she replied with her trademark understatement, "From America." This flight made her a legend. She was no longer Lady Lindy. She was Amelia Earhart, the greatest female pilot in the world, an icon of courage and a symbol of the limitless possibilities of the modern age. But for a woman who had already conquered the Atlantic, there was only one great challenge left: to circle the globe. Part 2. The final fateful flight. Her world flight was to be her final crowning achievement. "I have a feeling that there is just about one more good flight left in my system, and I hope this is it." It would not just be a stunt, it would be a scientific endeavor, following the longest, hardest route, a 29,000-mile journey circumnavigating the globe as close to the equator as possible. Her aircraft was a state-of-the-art, twin-engined Lockheed Electra 10E, which she called her flying laboratory. It was heavily modified, its passenger cabin ripped out and replaced with enormous fuel tanks, giving it the range for the marathon legs across the oceans. Her navigator was the best in the business, Fred Noonan. A former Pan Am navigator, Noonan was a master of the complex art of celestial navigation and dead reckoning, essential skills for finding tiny islands in the vastness of the Pacific. He was a brilliant navigator, but also a man with a reputation for heavy drinking, a detail that would later add another layer of speculation to the mystery.
3 months later, she was ready to try again. This time, due to changing weather patterns, she would fly from west to east. The journey began on June 1st, 1937, from Miami. For the next month, the world watched as Earhart and Noonan made their way across the globe. They flew across the South Atlantic to Africa, then across the heart of the continent to the Red Sea. They crossed India, flew over the jungles of Southeast Asia, and hopped across the islands of the Dutch East Indies. By all accounts, it was a grueling, exhausting trip. The relentless heat, the long hours in the cramped cockpit, and the constant stress of navigation and mechanical upkeep were taking their toll. By the time they reached Lae, New Guinea, on June 29th, they had completed over 22,000 miles of their journey. Only 7,000 miles remained, but it was the most dangerous part, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Central Pacific. The next leg was the ultimate challenge, a 2,556-mile flight from Lae to Howland Island, a tiny, flat, uninhabited coral island just 2 miles long and half a mile wide. It was a mere speck in the Pacific, the last great blank spot on the map. Finding it would be a supreme test of Noonan's skill and their radio equipment. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed at Howland, tasked with providing weather reports and crucially, a radio beacon for Earhart to home in on. The atmosphere in Leh was tense. The Electra was dangerously overloaded with fuel, carrying over 1,100 gallons for the estimated 18-hour flight. To save weight, they made a decision that may have sealed their fate. They removed the long, trailing wire antenna for their radio, which was capable of transmitting on lower frequencies that were easier for direction finding. They would rely solely on their higher frequency voice radio. At 10 a.m. on July 2nd, under a gray, overcast sky, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan pushed the throttles of the Electra to the firewall. The overloaded plane lumbered down the runway, struggling to gain speed. It bounced once, then twice, before finally, reluctantly, lifting into the air at the very end of the runway, clearing the trees by a terrifyingly small margin. They were off. They would never be seen again by friendly eyes. Part 3. The Search and the Theories. The 18 hours that followed were a masterclass in frustration and miscommunication. Aboard the Itasca, the radio operators listened intently for Earhart's transmissions. For most of the night, there was only silence. Then, in the early morning hours, her voice began to come through, faint and sporadic. She reported cloudy weather, which would have made celestial navigation by the stars impossible for Noonan. The Itasca transmitted a steady stream of signals, both voice and Morse code, hoping she could use them to find the island. They fired up their boilers, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky to serve as a visual marker. But it became agonizingly clear that while they could hear her, she could not hear them. Her radio receiver was either malfunctioning or on the wrong frequency. She was flying blind, searching for an invisible island. After her final, fateful transmission at 8:43 a.m., the silence from her radio became a deafening alarm. The Itasca immediately began a search. Within hours, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the largest and most expensive sea and air search in naval history up to that point. The battleship Colorado, the aircraft carrier Lexington, and numerous destroyers and smaller vessels, along with 66 aircraft, converged on the area, scouring over 200,000 square miles of the Pacific. They found nothing. No oil slick, no floating wreckage, no sign of the Electra. After 16 days, the official search was called off. The official conclusion was that the Electra had run out of fuel, crashed into the ocean, and sunk without a trace. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. For decades, this was the accepted story, but it was a conclusion born of a lack of evidence, not proof. And in the vacuum of proof, theories began to grow, branching out from the plausible to the fantastic. The Gardner Island or Nikumaroro hypothesis. This is the most compelling and scientifically researched alternative theory. Put forth by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGAR, it posits that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, turned south along the line of position she mentioned in her last broadcast. This line runs directly through a small, uninhabited atoll, then known as Gardner Island, now Nikumaroro. The theory suggests they saw the island's reef, landed the Electra on a flat coral surface during low tide, and survived for a time as castaways. The evidence is tantalizing. In the days following her disappearance, dozens of credible radio operators across the Pacific and even in the United States reported hearing faint, desperate distress calls on Earhart's frequencies. These post-loss signals were dismissed at the time, but TIGAR's analysis suggests they were genuine. Furthermore, a British colonial expedition that visited the island in 1940 discovered a partial human skeleton, a woman's shoe, a sextant box of a type used by Noonan, and the remnants of a campfire. The skeleton was examined by a British doctor who, using outdated forensic methods, concluded it belonged to a male. The bones were subsequently lost. However, a modern reanalysis of the doctor's original measurements by forensic anthropologists concluded that the skeleton was consistent with a female of Earhart's height and ethnic origin. Tigar expeditions to Nikumaroro have found other artifacts from the 1930s, including a glass jar that appears to be for a brand of anti-freckle cream Earhart was known to use. The theory paints a tragic picture of Earhart and Noonan surviving the landing, only to slowly perish from thirst and exposure on a desolate island, their radio calls for help growing weaker until they finally fell silent. The Saipan Japanese capture theory. A darker, more conspiratorial theory holds that Earhart and Noonan were on a secret espionage mission for the U.S. government. The story goes that President Roosevelt asked Earhart to deviate from her flight path to overfly Japanese-held islands like Truk and Saipan, which were being illegally militarized. In this scenario, they were either shot down or forced to land, captured by the Japanese, and eventually executed as spies. Proponents of this theory point to unverified accounts from Saipan natives who claim to have seen a white woman and man held prisoner, and even the execution of a female pilot. Some even claim to have seen her plane. However, no official Japanese or American documents have ever surfaced to support this theory, and it remains in the realm of sensational speculation. Epilogue: The Echo of a Legacy. The search for Amelia Earhart has never truly ended. It has continued for over 80 years, in the depths of the ocean and in the dusty archives of history. She is a flickering ghost in the American imagination, a symbol of a mystery so profound it feels almost like a national myth. But to remember her only for her disappearance is to do a disservice to her life. Amelia Earhart's true legacy is not the mystery of her death, but the power of her example. She was a pioneer who broke barriers in the sky and on the ground, a voice for equality and opportunity who inspired a generation of women to dream bigger. She lived by a simple, powerful creed, which she wrote to her husband in a letter to be opened in the event of her death on one of her flights. She wrote, "Please know I am quite aware of the hazards. I want to do it because I want to do it. Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others." Amelia Earhart's final flight may have ended in failure and silence, but her life was a resounding success. The search for her plane is, in a way, a search for a piece of that fearless, adventurous American spirit she so perfectly embodied. Her final resting place may remain the Pacific's greatest secret, but her story, her courage, and her legacy continue to echo, as clear and powerful as her voice once was on the radio, calling out across the vast, silent ocean.